Born and raised in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, Felipe Hinojosa is Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. He serves as Director for the Carlos H. Cantu Hispanic Education and Opportunity Endowment at Texas A&M and is editor for the interdisciplinary, peer-reviewed, and online moderated forum Latinx Talk, which also has podcasts. His work has appeared in Zocalo Public Square, Western Historical Quarterly, American Catholic Studies, and in multiple edited collections on Latino studies. His new book, the topic of today's presentation, Apostles of Change, Latino Radicals, Politics, Church Occupations, and the Fight to Save the Barrio, published by University of Texas Press in 2021, is set in 4 major cities, Chicago, Houston, New York, and Los Angeles, where in 1969 and 1970, Latino radicals clashed with religious leaders as they occupied churches to protest urban renewal, poverty, police brutality, and racial discrimination. Please join with me in welcoming our speaker, Felipe Hinojosa.
It's such an honor for me to be here today. I just want to thank Dr. DJ Gonzalez, Dr. Ignacio Garcia, and everybody that for a long time have worked to make something like this possible. And happy Hispanic Heritage Month, and as we celebrate and remember all of the work that folks have done to get us to this place and to get us in this position. So it's just an honor for me to be here. It's my second time in this great state of Utah. It's beautiful out here, and the weather is a nice break from Texas, for sure. So the people that were gathered at Orlando Davila's home on the night of May 3rd of 1969 saw it all happen. First, the shouting that came from the street in front of Davila's house, then the realization that it was a man with a gun pointed right at them. And the next moment, 2 shots fired. One of those shots hit Manuel Ramos in the head near his right eye. Another shot hit Rafael Rivera in the neck. Chaos ensued when the man with the gun, later identified as off-duty Chicago police officer James Lamb, was seen walking away. Lamb later testified that he fired his weapon only after he heard shots fired from across the street. And when he proceeded to investigate, he reported seeing 3 men, one of whom he heard say, "Get away from there or I'll blow your head off." And another he reportedly saw reach for a weapon. Witnesses refuted Lamb's testimony, arguing instead that the police officer was the aggressor. The remaining details of that night on May 3rd in 1969 are murky. But we know that as Manuel Ramos and Rafael Rivera were taken to the hospital, 4 of their good friends, Pedro Martinez, Jose Lind, Sal de Rivero, and Orlando Davila, all part of this new group that had called themselves the Young Lords Organization, were arrested, taken into custody, and tried for assaulting an officer. Manuel Ramos died later that night. James Lamb, the police officer who shot and killed him and wounded Rivera, was cleared of any wrongdoing. Manuel Ramos was a father, he was a husband, and a brother. His death robbed his 2 children, a 2-year-old daughter and a 6-month-old baby boy at the time, of their father. Those that knew him best described him as quiet and a mild-mannered man. He served as Minister of Defense for a Young Lords organization that in 1969 was still trying to find its way, still working to see how best they could help their community, and still learning the intricacies of revolutionary politics. Ramos's death, however, would serve as a turning point for the young militant group. His death brought together his fellow Young Lords from the Lincoln and Humboldt Park neighborhoods in Chicago, as well as members of the Black Panthers and the white Appalachian group known as the Young Patriots, at his memorial service at Santa Teresa's Catholic Church. And if any of you have seen Judas and the Black Messiah, the Young Lords make a brief showing in that one, in that film. His death, Manuel Ramos's death, and the solidarity that came from black and white revolutionary groups at the time sparked a political fire in the members of the Young Lords. It was a key moment for the leader of the Lords, Jose Chacha Jimenez, who later confessed to journalist Frank Browning that the murder of Manuel Ramos was the point that, quote, I became a real revolutionary. Now, Manuel Ramos's death added fuel to an already active organizing presence in Chicago neighborhoods, from Uptown to Lawndale to Lincoln Park, as multiple groups turned up the heat in the summer of 1969. Black, Latino, and white activist groups occupied institutions. They established breakfast programs for school children. They organized rallies. They opened health clinics and published newspapers that promoted solidarity across race and ethnicity. Mutual aid was only part of the story, however. Across the nation in the late 1960s, cities burned. The historian Elizabeth Hinton has noted that it was a violence and death on a scale not seen since the Civil War. Every major urban center in the country burned during those years. The history of Latinos in urban America in the 1960s, their struggles against displacement, poverty, police brutality, and violence is one that, even with all of the great work that has been published, especially in the last 10 years, remains not yet fully understood. The stories of how Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans simultaneously turned to violence and mutual aid to secure equal rights, improve unequal conditions, and push back against displacement remain for the most part understudied. I certainly did not expect to be delving into this history. This is a copy of my book, as you can see, one of rebellion and occupation. If you know anything about my first book, it was about rural Mennonites in South Texas and Puerto Rico, far, far away from the American city, right? But these stories, they hooked me in and just never let me go. It's the fantastic photographs that I found, the deep political meaning that gripped me. I realized that these stories of church occupations were about Latinos and their place in the American city, about their fights against displacement, and about the long tradition of mutual aid. Now, this is also a deeply personal story for me. Ever since I can remember, I've been fascinated with church buildings, the art and symbols that decorate their walls, the public space that engulfs them, and the spiritual meanings they carry for marginalized communities. Much of this fascination has to do with my upbringing. I grew up a preacher's kid in South Texas, which meant that I spent a lot of time in church. Either Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights, singing, praying, everything, right? I was all there for it. When I wasn't doing that, I was playing basketball in the hot concrete box that we call the gymnasium right behind our church. I'll admit that my view of the church as a sacred and holy space, however, did not develop until my teenage years, when in the 1980s, our church in Brownsville, Texas, became a sanctuary church, a space for refugees from Central America who were escaping war and violence in their home communities. They would stay a while, make a couple of long-distance phone calls when that was a thing, right? Get a meal, shower, get cleaned up, contact relatives, and then make their way further up north. Men and women whose life circumstances I most certainly did not understand until later. These experiences left a deep impression in my life that today fuels much of the interest in uncovering the history of how sacred spaces dwell in neighborhoods that surround them and how they embody the transnational politics that have resulted as a result of globalization, immigration, and war. And in doing so, I joined a long list of scholars that have documented the history of resistance, from slave spirituals to global independence movements to the social gospel that emerged side by side with the labor movement in the United States, to show how the just future envisioned by today's leaders of this new sanctuary movement indeed has a history, a multi-ethnic and a multiracial history. One of the starting points of that past, I contend, starts in the struggles between faith and radicalism that took root in barrios across America. And my book focuses on these tensions in 4 American cities that were central destination points, where Mexican immigrants and Puerto Rican migrants arrived in large numbers throughout much of the 20th century. And thus these stories feature the children of these mass migrations to LA, to Houston, to New York City, and to Chicago. Here, the 1960s generation of Chicanos and Puerto Ricans made it clear that they were prepared to risk their lives to fight for freedom, for justice, and really a place to call home. To get through all of this today in a timely manner, I'm going to focus on where it all began in this book and on the first chapter on Chicago, in Chicago of May of 1969. There, the fight against urban renewal prompted the occupation of McCormick Theological Seminary and later the Armitage Methodist Church. These occupations kicked off a national movement of Latino radical activist groups occupying churches and disrupting church services. Just imagine your church service being disrupted, right? Each occupation that I cite lasted 5 to 14 days, right? Actually, the one in Houston lasted 21 days. It was the longest one. And the case that I cover in Los Angeles was actually just a one-night disruption of Christmas Eve Mass. This is one of my favorite photos, by the way, right? We do know that Christ did not own a Cadillac, right? In New York City, the Young Lords occupied the First Spanish United Methodist Church, and in a matter of 11 days, this is the First Spanish United Methodist Church. This is a more recent photo. In a matter of 11 days, organized a free clothing drive, breakfast programs, a liberation school, political education classes, a daycare center, a healthcare center. They got students from Columbia to come in and do tuberculosis testing inside of the church. 11 days, folks. It was incredible. And those of you that are familiar with the Lower East Side and the New Yorican Poets Cafe, where poetry is spoken to this day, right? The New Yorican Poets Cafe really starts within the walls of this church. Inside the church, the group hung a white sheet with a painted message that read, "Bienvenidos a la Iglesia del Pueblo." Welcome to the People's Church. The occupation of the church attracted large crowds and helped them increase the group's membership in boroughs across the city. The Young Lords started in Chicago, but they developed a second chapter in New York City. They were so popular that the Reverend David Kirk of Emmaus House proudly proclaimed that if Christ were alive today, he'd have been a young Lord. Imagine Christ as a Puerto Rican militant, right? In Houston, the Mexican-American Youth Organization occupied the San Juan Marcos Presbyterian Church, and like the Young Lords, they did the same thing. They set up healthcare programs, they set up a breakfast program, and they had tremendous support from the North Side Barrio, just north of downtown there in Houston. Now, each occupation not only garnered the attention of white religious leaders, people were genuinely frightened and afraid that their church was next in the occupation, but it also buoyed, it helped, it stimulated the work of Latino Catholic and Protestant leadership, which up until this day, we've only sort of been most familiar with their work in the United Farm Worker Movement, right? To be able to find the work of Latino preachers and pastors in these cities was one of the greatest finds, I think, for me in the archives, is to find their documents and their words in response to what was happening at this time. So back to Manuel Ramos. Days after Ramos's death in Chicago on May 3rd of 1969, and as a way to protest urban renewal, members of the Young Lords, together with a coalition of community folks, the Poor People's Coalition, and with the help from seminary students, from white seminary students, they walked onto the campus. This is the campus of McCormick Theological Seminary, and they occupied the building and renamed it the Manuel Ramos Memorial Building after their good friend as an homage and a signal to the institutions in the Lincoln Park neighborhood that urban renewal, or urban removal, as they called it, was not going to go down without a fight. So a little on the Young Lords. Their political rise in Chicago from a street gang organized in the late 1950s to revolutionary nationalists a decade later became emblematic of a grassroots movement in Chicago neighborhoods and part of a broader rainbow coalition politics of the late 1960s in Chicago. The group was predominantly Puerto Rican, but not completely so. They had members who were Mexican-American, Mexican immigrant, African-American, and white that were part of the Young Lords and their movement in Chicago. And their engagements with a Presbyterian bureaucracy that they absolutely knew nothing about. McCormick Seminary was part of the Presbyterian Church, and the Young Lords had never met a Presbyterian preacher, even a Latino one at that time, right? So to give you an idea, the maps are better in the book, by the way. This is just a Google one that I was able to get. But just to give you sort of a sense of the Lincoln Park neighborhood, located in the near north side of the city, in the 1960s, Lincoln Park was a neighborhood defined both by its ethnic mix and the shared experiences of displacement. And I'm just gonna, the next slide will just zoom in so you get a better view of Lincoln Park there. It became the battleground for one of the most important fights against urban renewal, or in today's terms, in terms of what we see happening with gentrification in today's cities, right? With a cast of characters that ranged from Puerto Rican nationalists to welfare mothers to seminary students. By the way, let me just interject really quick that in writing this book, I've had so many of those McCormick Theological Seminary students that have reached out to me that have somehow found their way to this book and have reached out, and that reading their emails has been such a joy. Entire couples that met and devoted themselves to each other at this occupation and now have grandchildren, right? So this occupation was also about love, I'll just say, okay? So the neighborhood was a battleground. Seminary students, welfare mothers, Puerto Rican nationalists. More on this later, though. First, picture this, all right? Victorian brownstone homes near the lake on the east to immigrant housing units to the west, and with plans for a shopping district with restaurants and entertainment possibilities known as the Magnificent Mile. Lincoln Park was one of the most competitive real estate markets in the city. Add to that the significant investments from a triad of institutions in the neighborhood. There were 3 central institutions in this neighborhood at the time: McCormick Seminary, DePaul University, and Children's Memorial Hospital. And a market where properties were sold quickly, and you can begin to understand why Lincoln Park was targeted in the way that it was by urban renewal hawks in the 1950s. In 1954, the Lincoln Park Conservation Association requested an urban renewal designation for the neighborhood, which included a $43 million budget, 50% of matching funds from the federal government, and a 4-stage, 10-year plan that would make it absolutely impossible for poor people of whatever background to be able to stay in that neighborhood. By 1957, there was a total of $160 million that was invested to completely transform Lincoln Park. The urban renewal trends in Chicago were part of a larger national project that began with federal legislation that focused on the redevelopment of what investors tagged as crumbling neighborhoods in prime locations, near business districts or attractive landscapes. This translated into the demolition of old buildings, raising rents to push poor people out, and making it impossible for poor and working people, mostly Latinos and African Americans, to stay put regardless of how long they had lived or made a home in that particular neighborhood. By the end of the 1960s, in a city with nearly 250,000 Latinos, urban renewal policies had in fact normalized displacement, pushing Latinos in Chicago from neighborhood to neighborhood, often into substandard housing units, where in some cases they even had to pay higher rents. Forcing Puerto Ricans out of neighborhoods, pricing them out of their homes, was part of a long tradition in the city of Chicago where, as Merida Rua put it, there existed a, quote, episodic pattern of constant movement, of loss and finding and more loss. Experiences of displacement are what made the Young Lords into the most radical and powerful Puerto Rican voice in the 1960s. Common experiences of police harassment, of displacement, and poverty that brought even non-Puerto Ricans to the Young Lords. People such as Omar Lopez, a Mexican immigrant, and Kenny Smith, who described himself as Appalachian white, joined the Young Lords organization out of a desire to fight against a system that was stacked against them right from the beginning. This is a photograph right outside of the Armitage Methodist Church that they had occupied. The pastors, Bruce and Jeannie Johnson, were friendly to the Young Lords, let them come in. This is one of the food programs that they had. This is one of also my favorite photographs here. As revolutionary nationalists, they built coalitions with groups such as the Black Panther Party, the Young Patriots, the group mostly made up of Appalachian whites who had migrated to the city, and Students for a Democratic Society, among others. They followed the example of the Black Panther Party and set up breakfast programs for kids, daycare centers, free healthcare clinics, and a legal aid office. Things we need even today, right, in our neighborhoods. These radical movements were only one part of the wide range of community activism that emerged in Chicago's neighborhoods in the 1960s. Now, the other side of this coin are the often overlooked is an often overlooked element of the faith-based social movements that emerged in Catholic and Protestant churches throughout the city of Chicago. Grounded in the early 20th century formulations of the social gospel, these movements blended faith and direct political action as a means to bring about social change. The eclectic mix of social gospel and evangelicalism that characterized Chicago made it one of liberal Protestantism's most important cities during the first half of the 20th century, and it developed a kind of clergy radical link-up that worried a lot of people, right? By the late 1960s, religious groups such as the Northside Cooperative Ministry in Lincoln Park were more direct in their activism as they forged a relationship with the Young Lords and other activist groups. The clergy radical link-up, as the Chicago Daily News called it, was central because it was through this association that the idea first emerged to occupy McCormick Seminary as a way to call out the hypocrisy of a Christian institution that in 1969 supported urban renewal and by association the continued displacement of Puerto Ricans and other poor people in the neighborhood. Now, you might be asking yourselves, why occupy a seminary? Why not occupy DePaul University? Why not occupy the Children's Hospital? The Young Lords occupied a hospital in New York City. Why not take it straight to the centers of power within that neighborhood? Because not only was McCormick, of those three, the weakest institution in the neighborhood, but the Lords believed that they could exploit the seminary's hypocrisy. Everything started on May 6, 1969. Remember, this is 3 days after Manuel Ramos had been killed, when a coalition of close to 1,000 people that included the Northside Cooperative Ministry, which was a neighborhood group there in Lincoln Park, the Young Lords, and seminary students rallied to protest the dedication of the newly built stone academic building. Black, Puerto Rican, and white community leaders joined McCormick students and faculty to voice their frustration over the $2 million price tag for the new building and to present seminary leaders with a set of demands. In dramatic fashion, seminary students set up a tent village. I don't have photos of those because I couldn't find originals, but there's a lot of great photographs of this tent village that was set up on campus where 29 students and their families camped out as a symbolic act of solidarity with the mostly Black and Puerto Ricans who were forced out of Lincoln Park. The next day, the seminary's newsletter described the scene at the stone building as one where, quote, a Wheaton insurance man and a North suburban pastor brushed shoulders, as it were, with a young militant Puerto Rican leader and welfare mothers. Another observer noted that children running around playing while their parents, some walking around with industrial workers of the world flags, who shuffled back and forth between watching their kids and condemning seminary leaders. I told you it was a family affair, right? And let me just also say that this is part of doing archival research and finding some of these things are these flyers that before Instagram, right? To be able to put these flyers up and post them up. What I love about this is look towards the bottom. This is sort of a critique on how McCormick Seminary is destroying and pushing people out of Lincoln Park. But look at the bottom. Come to the protest for music, dancing, and fun. Who doesn't want to go to a protest where there's music, dancing, and fun, right? The very next day, on May 7th, as McCormick's administration met with its board of trustees, a coalition of students and community leaders presented them with a set of demands. These were the demands that they sent to the seminary. $601,000 for low-income housing, facilities for a daycare center, legal aid, on and on and on. And calling on the seminary to publicly condemn the government attacks and FBI surveillance of the Black Panthers, of the Young Lords, and of the growing Latin American Defense Organization, another group in Chicago. Each demand was carefully crafted with the help of McCormick's students and with the close guidance of a young man by the name of Obed Lopez, the leader of the Latin American Defense Organization, and his brother, Omar Lopez, who was a member of the Young Lords. Both were Mexican immigrants. In the end of that, none of it mattered. All the presentations, the board rejected every single one of these demands. That prompted the occupation. The groups have seized the building, the local socialist press reported, and they are black, they are Latin, and they are white. Little red books are in evidence, and the clenched fist is the accepted greeting. The occupation of the stone building capped off a prosperous and turbulent decade for McCormick Seminary. Remember, they had just built the stone building, spent $2 million building it. In the 1960s, McCormick enjoyed a financial prosperity that allowed them to hire new faculty, raise $10 million for campus development, and begin construction on a new $1.2 million student dormitory. They were on the up and up. Economic prosperity, however, had masked larger institutional problems. In the 1960s, students demanded that the seminary hire black faculty and staff and provide courses in black history and culture, and that it break its tight relationship with the oh-so-white Lincoln Park Conservation Association. McCormick's troubles were not unique. Theological schools across the country at this time faced strong challenges from their students in the midst of a changing political and theological atmosphere in the 1960s. This was an era of theological change for seminaries, for churches, and mainline Protestant denominations that shook their very foundations. Think about the rise of liberation theology in Latin America and across the United States. And even as seminaries and churches celebrated record financial surpluses that spurred on new construction, soaring enrollment, and new programming in the post-war era, they froze. They literally froze in the face of the moral questions that were being raised by the black freedom struggle. Now, this entire occupation here at McCormick lasts only 5 days, and there are a variety of reports on what went on inside the building, the negotiations between the lords, the young lords, and the seminary administration, and so on, all of which are fine and items that I go into detail into the book. But for the purposes of my talk today, I just want to go straight to where the story takes kind of an unexpected turn and why the occupation ended so abruptly. As it turns out, just as the Young Lords had occupied the seminary building, the United Presbyterian Church USA was beginning its 181st General Assembly in San Antonio, Texas. When the Lords stepped foot on this campus to occupy the seminary, Obed Lopez, the leader of the Latin American Defense Organization, boarded a bus for San Antonio. Lopez not only worked his way into the agenda as a delegate, but he also had the opportunity to meet African-American leaders like former SNCC leader James Foreman, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Gayrod Wilmore, who was a leader of the Office on Church and Race for the Presbyterians, and Eleazar Risco, the editor of La Raza newspaper, who came in all the way from Los Angeles. This is a wonderful photo that I found of all of them, and right in the center there with his hands like this, that's James Foreman. And immediately over here to our left, on the far left is Obed Lopez. Next to him is Eleazar Risco, that's James Foreman right in the middle, and Gayrod Wilmore right next to him. As you can see, there were cameras at this 181st Presbyterian Church Conference. I didn't realize it was that fancy, but they had cameras, there were microphones, and this group came together. Now, however much Latino clergy, and there were a lot of Latino clergy at this conference, however much they hoped to make a splash, there was no doubt that the star of the show was James Foreman there at the center. The former SNCC leader had put white church leaders on high alert, some of you might remember, with his bold demands in the Black Manifesto. The Black Manifesto demanded that churches, white churches in particular, pay $500 million in reparations for slavery. And church disruptions in places like Detroit and New York. He had literally walked into Riverside Church in New York City and read his Black Manifesto to a stunned church audience. As Foreman addressed the Presbyterian Assembly, it was clear that his charisma had captured the day. Those who heard him speak described his talk as, quote, witty, knowledgeable, and scathing. If the presence of Foreman at the General Assembly felt, quote, like a storm breaking around the heads of the church, the Latino contingent seemed to pale in comparison. They were quiet for the most part, unassuming, and they were largely unknown. Few in the audience that day at that conference, even though they were in San Antonio, Texas, felt threatened at all by the Latino clergy. For white Presbyterians, Latino demands simply lacked the historical weight and urgency of Foreman's manifesto. Latinos were a people without a history at this assembly, a people who in the 1960s were considered by many as, quote, an invisible minority. So when it came to Lopez's time, and this is an actual photo that the Presbyterian Archives has of Lopez presenting his talk at the assembly, he carried, Obed Lopez did, a heavy burden. Not only did Lopez have to compete with the charisma and power of Foreman's demands, he had to do so in a way that filled in the huge gap that most of the delegate body had about Latino activism and politics. And although Lopez might not have upstaged Foreman's fiery and charismatic style on that day, he did enough to compel the assembly to take his demands seriously. This meant two things primarily. One, that they would begin working with the local Chicago presbytery and the offices at the National Board of Missions to negotiate with the young radicals. Think about that. That's a huge, huge move, right? Part of that negotiation included funding for a low-income housing proposal for Lincoln Park to counter the plans being put forth by the city that was set to transform Lincoln Park, among other things. As a result, 5 days after the occupation and with the confirmation that Lopez received at the assembly, Lopez assures his comrades in Chicago that it was time to end the occupation on May 18th of 1969. Now, the following months and leading into the summer of 1969, after that occupation during the so-called Rainbow Summer of 1969, McCormick Seminary, with the help of the local Chicago Presbytery and the National Board of Missions, started delivering on the demands that Lopez had made at the assembly. First came a $3,000 check to hire Howard Allen and Associates to develop and draw up a competitive bid for low-income housing in Lincoln Park. But even so, Lopez and the Lords remained frustrated with the pace of church leaders who stalled or completely rejected the remaining 8 demands that were outlined at the assembly. As a result, they moved on from there to occupy, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Armitage Methodist Church and started to hold important activities at the building. And as you can see, there was always music and singing. We were going to rap about neighbors and about community concerns. We're going to rap with neighbors about community concerns, and we were going to share a free meal, right? These flyers are give me life when I'm in the archives and it's kind of quiet, and I see these and I think about this. Think about every Sunday you can go to this and get a free meal. How great is that, right? This is the picture of the Armitage Methodist Church. You can see that at the front, they put a sign there, People's Church, Iglesia de la Gente. This was taken by Chicago photographer Carlos Flores. And immediately the sides of the church are used as sort of billboards to promote Latino history and specifically Puerto Rican history there. By late 1969, by the late fall of 1969, just as a new low-income housing proposal was being drafted by Howard Allen and Associates to submit to the city. Look, take us seriously. You have these ideas for urban renewal. We've got a different vision. We want mixed income housing. Here's our plan. We've got architects that have designed it. It's real. It's legit. We have paid for it. Let's make it happen. They had done that and had working to finalize that. It was at that point that Latino Presbyterian clergy from Chicago organized at that time as something that was called the Presbyterian Latin American Caucus, entered the picture and entered the discussions and they were unfortunately dead set on blocking any collaboration, financial or otherwise, between Presbyterian institution and these radical outsiders. In the midst of building a movement responding to the social needs of the people of Lincoln Park, and just as their proposal for low-income housing began to take shape, Latino Presbyterians and Latino Protestants in general became another roadblock. And here's why. I'll tell you why. Latino clergy had claimed that in the last few years, they had also drafted proposals for daycare centers, for free healthcare clinics, and social services, only to be rejected every time by white Presbyterian leadership. But now the demands from these radical outsiders, they argued, had opened the denomination's treasure chest in a way it had never seen before. The Reverend Jose Burgos argued that, quote, these proposals are another example of the presbytery funding outsiders, not insiders. That is faithful Presbyterian pastors. There are higher priorities in mission development for Latin communities than funding of these organizations. Another pastor noted that, quote, the kids from the Young Lords organization are scaring a lot of naive, guilty gringo suckers around who don't know the score. And the hits kept coming. The Lords were dismissed as, quote, hippies who do not represent the Puerto Rican and Mexican American communities. The frustration aimed at the Lords was coming from a cadre of Latino Protestant clergy who felt like they had been upstaged by a group of religious outsiders, and in many ways, they had been. By the spring of 1970, the pushback coming from Latino Presbyterians, however, was not enough to drown out the enthusiasm that had developed for a low-income housing proposal which promised to be a serious bid among two other competitive bids for the city of Chicago to consider. The proposal from Howard Allen and Associates called for a 36-unit apartment complex. This was the vision that they had for that housing complex, 36-unit apartment complex with plans to eventually expand to 70 that included ramps to make the laundry area accessible to all residents and to community streets for people to host parties. Imagine neighborhoods being drawn up so neighbors could host parties. And you're doing laundry and you can watch the kids, you know, all of that stuff. Plan that would be available for low-income residents, far surpassing, right, the 15% minimum that was mandated in terms of low-income housing that was mandated by the federal government at the time. The Chicago Sun-Times calls this proposal imaginative and urges the city of Chicago to seriously consider, quote, the new concepts being proposed by this indigenous group of Chicagoans. They are the voice of the people in the neighborhood, and they are entitled to be heard. Support also came from a coalition of professional architects across the city that called the proposal, quote, exciting as architecture, and pleaded with the city to approve it. Of course, there was resistance to the proposal that emerged from some of the more conservative leadership within the neighborhood. One Lincoln Park resident found the proposal to be, quote, sociologically and architecturally appalling. And another resident said, quote, I ask you not to turn this area into another low-income slum. These comments aside, in the end, even the conservative and pro-urban renewal Lincoln Park, the Community Conservation Council of Lincoln Park, approved, by the way, by Mayor Daley himself, overwhelmingly supports this proposal with an 11-2 vote. Out of the three proposals that came out of the neighborhood that were being considered, only the coalition's proposal received full community support. Unheard of, right? Go from an occupation to full community support from people on both sides of the debate. This should have sealed the deal for Lincoln Park's future, but instead it only fired up city leaders who at the end of the day ignored the community's choice, something it had not done before, and instead selected the Hartford construction company whose proposal fit better with the city's development plans and whose low-income housing designation barely met the federal minimum of 15%. This, as you can imagine, was a crushing loss. You could not have scripted a better plan of action. The Young Lords and the Poor People's Coalition occupied and demanded funding from McCormick Seminary. They hired an architect. They got Chicago Housing Authority to ensure that they would secure 40% of units for low-income families. And in what was perhaps their greatest victory, their proposal won the support from their enemies, the pro-urban renewal group in Lincoln Park. As more than 300 members of the Poor People's Coalition crowded into City Hall, the news that the Department of Urban Renewal had rejected their bid brought on an auditory gasp in the room from the community. The Lords and Lincoln Park in general would really never recover, never be the same again. Perhaps it is this loss, the fact that a valiant push to put the brakes on urban renewal in Chicago failed, that has kept the Young Lords from their place among some of the most important civil rights groups of their generation. When the decision came down in the spring of 1970, it had been more than a year of nonstop organizing, coupled with stints in jail. All right, the Young Lords were not saints. I'm not trying to make them to be saints, right? They spent time in jail. There were nonstop twists and turns in a story that is one of the most important in the fight against urban renewal at this time. They were frustrated, they were angry, they were heavily surveilled, and flat out exhausted by the spring of 1970. The sense of loss would prove too difficult of a hurdle to overcome. As bad as this loss was, and if you know anything about Lincoln Park and what it looks like today, you know no one could have predicted it that in the years after this occupation, McCormick Seminary would institute Latino and Black theological studies. Actually, in 1973, they hosted a consultation on, quote, Latino strategies for the 1970s Midwest that attracted over 300 Latino clergy, community activists, and politicians from across the Midwest. This was, as they called it, un diálogo entre la iglesia y el barrio, a conversation between the church and the neighborhood to discuss issues such as racism, mental health, community control, and education. So I'm going to end my talk where I began, with Manuel Ramos, the loss of a dear friend, a comrade in the struggle. He was a husband, a father of 2 babies, changed the course of his family's history and that of the Young Lords. In the days after the low-income housing proposal from the coalition was rejected by the city, activists continued to pay a heavy price. On March 23, 1970, the Latin American Defense Organization offices were ransacked and burned to the ground. Their files, furniture, all that Obed Lopez had worked to build was lost forever. And as quickly as their light shot up, the Lords also started their own steady decline in the spring of 1970. Members of the Young Lords organization spent time in jail and out of jail, remained under strict FBI surveillance, and they feared for their own lives as they witnessed the loss of people close to them. Manuel Ramos in 1969, the Reverend Bruce and Jeannie Johnson that I mentioned, who were allies in the struggle at the Armitage Methodist Church, were brutally killed. Their murder remains unsolved to this day. And Fred Hampton, the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, killed by police in December of 1969. In Chicago, the Young Lords worked at a dizzying pace to reduce gang violence, to make sure kids did not go to school hungry, to provide access to free health care, and to participate in a collaborative project to build a people's park in the neighborhood. They were pragmatists that provided social services even as they linked their struggles against colonialism with that of activists in Latin America and across the Third World. They staged their struggle out of their own sense of loss, out of their struggles, as they sought to make the invisible visible, to make Spanish-speaking communities come alive, and to highlight their experiences of police brutality, segregation, and poverty. They were muckraker journalists, really, documenting the ills of society in newspaper articles, by showing up to city council meetings, by claiming their place in the neighborhood, and by building trust with families in the community. What they are not often remembered for, but what I hope my work adds to their litany of accomplishments, is their role in planting the seeds for Latino religious politics. Few white church leaders knew anything about this invisible minority. Not after 1969. By the end of 1969, what had started in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood had now spread across the country as Mexican-American and Puerto Rican activists laid claim to a colonial institution whose own foundations were cracking under the weight of rapid change in the 1960s. Yes, they were occupying churches that were irresponsive to the needs of the barrio, but they were also bringing attention to a system of inequality that had normalized displacement, anti-Black and anti-Latino sentiment, and poverty. And this is, I believe, the continued legacy of the church occupations and religious reform that followed in the 1970s. Occupiers and clergy that supported them tapped into a tradition of mutual aid in the midst of violence and displacement, and laid the groundwork for a progressive religious movement that remains at the forefront of today's movements for justice. Thank you so much. Man, look at the time. So I do know that there are students that need to get to class, and so if that's what you need to do, for sure, do it. And I know that there's time for questions, Professor Gonzalez, right? So I'll take any questions that you all might have. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question around the Young Lords being a multi-ethnic group and why it would have appealed more to Puerto Ricans. Well, the Young Lords start out as a group of Puerto Ricans, and they were originally a street gang that went by that name. And so it begins as kind of a friendship in the neighborhood, the kind of stuff that street gangs get involved with in the late 50s and the early 1960s. And it's actually a stint in jail for Chacha Jimenez, who you saw a little bit right at the beginning, actually, of the slideshow right there. It begins with a stint in jail where he begins to read up Frantz Fanon, and he begins to study history and study the relationship of colonialism and the history of Puerto Ricans, that he has sort of an awakening, a political consciousness that takes over for him. And so when he comes out, probably around 1967 or 68, somewhere around there, when he comes out of jail, he joins kind of that uprising and upsurge of more militant activism that is really beginning to take off, especially in the wake of MLK's assassination. Yes?
Kind of piggybacking off of that, this conglomerate, right, that is the Young Lords, do you see any of this maybe as like internal issues to that? I mean, highly racialized era in the United States. Do you see any of that, or?
Yeah, you know, within them, they're obviously sort of trying to figure out how to build these coalitions. One thing that they knew was that nobody was sort of grabbing the attention of the city in the way that the Black Panthers were, and the kind of brilliance that Fred Hampton was as a chairman of the Black Panther Party in the city. And so for them, really it was about, there's no way that a group of Puerto Ricans and some Mexicanos that were part of this group are going to kind of garner the kind of attention that that the Black Panthers are. And so it benefited them more than anything to join this coalition and to form it. In the film that you saw, Judas and the Black Messiah, if any of you have seen it, if not, I would highly recommend it. There's a very just sort of short clip of Chacha Jimenez. He makes an appearance very, very briefly. But it is, I think, coming out of this sense of kind of racial dynamics within the Puerto Rican community. You're talking, Chacha was very light-skinned, colored eyes, blondish kind of hair, right? And Puerto Rican sort of ranging that skin color and skin tone. And the Black Panther Party also not only looking at race and racial discrimination, but saying there's no way you can understand that without understanding capitalism and the devastation and poverty and the way all of this works. These were some of the sorts of things that they were at least initially trying to figure out. It's actually FBI surveillance and COINTELPRO and all of these other kind of outside elements that begin to plant the seeds of doubt within these organizations, and part of the reason that they start to break up into the 1970s. But as Gordon Mantler and others are, talking about Harold Washington's mayoral candidacy in the 1980s, building that kind of multi-ethnic and bringing Latinos into that, some people see this grouping here, this sort of group of neighborhood activists, as being forerunners of what comes later. Yeah. Yes? Yeah, no, that's a great question. The opposition never really fully dies off with some of the Presbyterian preachers, but what begins to happen is, especially people like the Reverend Jose Burgos, which, by the way, I follow him 3 years later, makes his way to Houston. He becomes pastor of the Juan Marcos Presbyterian Church and had heard about the Mexican American Youth Organization occupying that church. He had already sort of come to understand what the Young Lords are trying to do. He had been baptized, let's just say, right? He had been transformed, right? The spirit of metanoia, it had completely transformed him. But it took conversation and negotiation and getting to know the Young Lords and understanding where they were coming from. And I think in a sense, the clergy wanted to be seen, wanted to be recognized, right? That they had been doing all of this work, really good, foundational, strong work, by the way, not just in Chicago, but in housing movements for low-income housing in San Francisco, all over California. Or Eduardo Contreras, who wrote a great book on Latinos in the liberal city in San Francisco, documents another one of these Presbyterian preachers, Roger Granados, who was heavily involved in those movements at the time. It takes that kind of time and conversation between these two groups that eventually makes it happen, plus the denominational support that did come eventually for Latino clergy to begin to establish Latino studies programs and so forth. Winning over the local opposition that they had came out of, I think more than anything, the kind of professionalization of the architectural plan, the sense that even some of their neighbors that would not get kicked out, right, that people could maybe, in fact, this mixed income housing thing could be a possibility, maybe it could work, some sense of hope. Don't get me wrong, this wasn't for them something that they completely, there were still a lot of resistance within the neighborhood, but to get the support of that board, I think was really quite significant. And then for the city of Chicago to completely sort of ignore it was, from what I read, the first time that sort of thing happened. So it's sort of an interesting dynamic there where you have these young radicals that oftentimes are not given credit for, we see radicals as being irresponsible. Maybe they were doing violence, burning things, whatever it was. And here within this Latino movement and what I see in different spaces, that radicalism often led to a kind of opening up of conversation and negotiation that allows reformers to step in, right, and get some of the things that they want done. Yeah. I know we had a question up here, right?
Yes, I wanted to ask about the Methodist Church once they were negotiating with the Presbyterians, but then occupied the Methodist Church and how they're involved. And I wanted to ask if the Catholic Church was involved.
So the Catholic Church had a lot of social service programs already in the city. They were very active in that sense. The Methodists come into play because they're right around the block. They're nearby. And if you see the map, there's a map in the book, and the church is just pretty close. There's a Walgreens there now. It's no longer there, the building. But they get involved because of that. Plus, this north side, the neighborhood cooperative ministry that was involved, that was sort of an assemblage of progressive churches in the neighborhood that was actually helping to fundraise some of the daycare centers and healthcare clinics and helping to fund that. The Armitage Methodist Church was a part of that. And Bruce and Jeannie Johnson were strong supporters of what the Young Lords wanted to do. Part of what I didn't mention in the talk, but what I talk a little bit about in the book, is that there was a Latino congregation meeting at Armitage Methodist Church, a Cuban congregation that was not too hot on what the Young Lords were doing, right? And it's sort of reminds me a little bit about the case in New York City where one of the Young Lords there, who's now gone on to become a journalist, very well-known, Juan Gonzalez. If any of you watch Democracy Now!, he's on there as a co-anchor with Amy Goodman. But one of the things that Juan Gonzalez talks about is the pastor in New York City was also Cuban, just like he was in Chicago. And Juan Gonzalez talks about, well, here you had a bunch of Che Guevara lookalikes, basically coming in and saying, can we use your building? It's a non-starter. It's not even going to happen, right? But the church does open up, and they become proud supporters of that movement for that time. After the brutal murder of Bruce and Jeannie Johnson in their home, it kind of dies off after that. The church, yeah. And that's a case that still is open, by the way. Yeah. Thank you. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
If the denial or non-acceptance of the economic plans starts to decline, do you have any sense of why they were declined? And does it have to do with the idea that it's not in line with the way the Chicago Public
Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there were a number of factors. I think this was certainly the loss of this was a significant one. I think in the oral history interviews, when I met with a lot of the young lords, this is what they would go back to on and on, just sort of back to the sense of we had done all of this. And even there was years later, I mean, in speaking to them in 2014 and 2015, it was a sense of like desperation and like we did all of that and yet we still lost. What's it all for at the end of the day? I think there was a real sense of loss. That was one thing in a number of other kind of factors that were all sort of cascading right around the same time that really sort of begins to affect the movement pretty strongly. Yeah. Yes. And then we'll come.
Follow-up to that, I mean, this great stuff is so fascinating, but it's also depressingly familiar.
Yeah.
In terms of some of the big issues, police brutality, affordable housing, and the impact all that has. This is a scholarly book, so it's going to have a scholarly audience, and as scholars, we'd also love everyone else to read all of our books. But if you could choose one non-scholarly audience that you think would most benefit from reading this history, who would it be?
People in the pews. People in the pews. Because I think when so one of the greatest thrills for me is if I get an email from a church member that says they're reading the book in Sunday school class. That for me is a thrill to no end. It's one thing to read it in a grad seminar where they're going to sift through it, right? And it's another thing to be in church and you're pulling this book out and talking about, well, what can we do as a church, right? When I think of a non-academic audience, I think about the power of the church in American society. I think about the numbers of people in the pews and the kind of role that churches can play. I suppose there's a place for them kind of, as transformative agents in the nation, but I think more importantly in their neighborhoods and people sort of in practical, everyday ways that churches can respond to this. I wrote a short piece that I think is going to come out later this year around church responses during the pandemic and about the big debate about whether you stay open or whether you shut down. And Samuel Rodriguez, who is a popular Puerto Rican pastor, president of the largest Latino evangelical association in the nation, was talking about we need to reopen and churches are worship spaces and this is what they're for and this is what we need to be doing to give people hope. On the flip side of that, many grassroots churches that don't get any media play, that nobody's interviewing those pastors, are literally, like in New York City, the one pastor I interviewed, literally renting U-Haul trucks and going to wealthy churches, picking up food, bringing it back to East Harlem, and then distributing it there, and opening their church as a food pantry, right? As a place where people could come and pick up bags of food. That's the place that I think about in terms of that untapped power of church folk and what they can do in their local communities. Yeah, absolutely. I know there was a question over here. Yeah.
How was like your research and kind of researching about all of these different movements has like impacted your identity as a
That's a great question. Two things. The first is I'm a Mexican American from South Texas. Everybody was Mexicano when I was growing up, and everybody was Catholic, and I was not. Okay, so I grew up Mennonite. It's a long story, but it's very, very different. But in doing this work in particular, I think just being part of a larger Latino community, right, and meeting Puerto Rican activists, meeting people in cities that I'm quite unfamiliar with, right? That side of activism. I didn't grow up in an urban area. I grew up surrounded by churches and religious leaders, but not in urban America. And so to be in these spaces and to learn from them about their own immigration stories, the fact that they were Mexican immigrants, they were undocumented in the 1960s, and they come to Chicago and meet Puerto Ricans, they meet Dominicans, they meet people from different parts of Mexico. And rather than develop a kind of, narrow sort of Mexican-centric movement, they saw the power in developing these sort of coalitions with these other movements. That was really powerful for me in talking, to these leaders and in shaping my identity as a Mexican American and being firmly rooted in that history and that culture, and yet understanding that I'm part of a larger tradition, and that was really significant. The other is the fact that in every case of the oral histories that I spoke to, they were about 18 or 19 years old when they were doing this. None of them knew what they were doing. None of them had any sense of direction. There wasn't a handbook. I mean, there wasn't, they were having kind of street corner conversations. There were, there's a woman that I write about in the book that was sort of influential for them in giving them some ideas about community organizing and all that. But it was ganas. It was like, let's just go do it and figure it out. And if we fail, we fail, but let's just try it. And that was inspiring in terms of, what I can do, now as a scholar, as a professor, and talking to my students. And when I teach this history and all of Latino or Chicano history, that's the most inspiring thing. I think I might have heard one student talk about meeting and hearing Marta Cotera or Mexican-American activists, listening to them talk and the kind of empowerment that it gives young people to say, maybe I can do something as well. And I think that had a big impact, continues to have a big impact on me. And I know that it has an impact on my students who today are dealing with, not similar, but in a lot of ways, a sense of, is this nation gonna make it? Are we gonna survive? I mean, this is when I spoke to Juan Gonzalez, he said, look, in 1969, and he was graduating from Columbia. This is an educated young man. He was like, yeah, but I was graduating, but there was no sense that I was going to get the big house and white picket fence and live the American dream. I didn't know if this country was going to survive 1969, And to still, in the midst of all of that, get in there and get involved and say, maybe I can do my part in my corner of the world, in my neighborhood, and make a difference and make a change. That impacted me greatly. Yeah, even though there is a sense of, this is a familiar story, there's more loss. History is full of those stories of loss and stuff just not working out, right? But I think at the same time, there's a lot of hope that we find within that on the struggle. Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more, or?
One quick one.
Okay, one quick one, yes.
Okay, so you've talked a lot about how churches and local organizations have been really helpful for a lot of activists in the past. But with the steady decline of organized religion in recent years, how have similar groups today had to adapt to it?
That's a great question. I don't know, to be honest with you, how they've had to adapt. There is a decline in church membership, and I want to say, and there's a lot of factors for why that's happened. Distrust with institutional religion, all of that. And yet, at the same time, you do see a cluster of young people within even evangelical churches that care about the environment, that are wanting to make a change, that are wanting to use their faith for good. And so even in that decline of, the sort of the numbers on a Sunday morning, I'm not as concerned about that, because there's still sort of an ethic, there's still kind of a morality that I think drives a lot of young people, even if they might not be at church on Sunday morning, and I see it in my students every time I teach, in a sense of that responsibility coming out of their faith. They grew up Catholic, they might not go to Mass very often, but they remember the lessons that their mother or that their parents taught them in terms of their social and personal responsibility to the community. I'm betting on that. That's where I'm at. I think there's a lot of people that study those trends, and I follow them closely as well. But I'm also inspired by kind of more recent movements. I'll tell you one more quick thing, and I'm going to wrap this up. But there's, in this article that I just wrote, there's a Pentecostal church in Los Angeles that I interviewed the church leadership there, most of whom are Central American. And in the midst of the pandemic, when they had to shut down, it was a real shock for the church. They had a difficult time shutting down. And they did the food pantry thing, they did kind of social services stuff. The murder of George Floyd transforms this small Pentecostal Latino community, because they start to see, what maybe the impact that this has on their own lives, but then also the sort of resurgence of African American history, people talking about the history of police brutality, the members beginning to ask, where do Latinos fit within that? Where's our history, right? What has been our story? Because we don't feel like we're a part of this nation in quite the same way that white folks do. So where's our history and our story? And this church has proceeded to do Sunday school lessons around the United Farm Worker Movement. This is where they're getting started. It's fantastic. It's great, right? There were Pentecostals in the United Farm Worker Movement. So, I mean, this is great. If you can join those two histories, I think that's phenomenal. I'll stop there. All right. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Y'all were so nice, and the questions were great. Thank you.